I'm Denis King. Welcome back to Key Changes, a musical memoir. Episode 3. In 1955 Britain, Variety, the post-war version of music hall, still represented the top of the entertainment tree, even if rock and roll was breathing down its neck. And we King brothers found ourselves on, well, the lower branches of that tree. In practice, this meant enduring a succession of long, wet seaside summer seasons, performing at the end of long, wet seaside piers, and surviving a miserable Christmas in Kaiserslautern, Germany, entertaining drunken GIs. But it started with us performing 6 shows a day, yes, 6, at London's famous Windmill Theatre. Mind you, we also got to see naked ladies 6 times a day, which to a growing 15-year-old boy certainly has its upside, if I can put it that way.
In 1955, Vivian Van Dam, a small grey-haired, smartly dressed but rather doddery old man who shuffled, was running the famous Windmill Theatre off Piccadilly Circus. The place had got its name from a windmill that stood on the site until the late 18th century, and today is an erotic table dancing club, but in Van Dam's day the windmill had 2 claims to fame. One was it had remained open throughout World War II, and the other was that it was the only legitimate place in London you could see a naked lady on stage. Despite the audience consisting almost exclusively of men in raincoats waiting to see a flash of nipple, it was a prestigious place to get a booking, and pretty much anybody who became anybody had done a stint at the windmill, especially comedians. Peter Sellers, Harry Seacombe, Frankie Howard, Benny Hill, Bruce Forsyth, Spike Milligan, Michael Bentine, Barry Cryer, Jimmy Edwards, Tony Hancock among them. But the occasional novelty or speciality act slipped in, such as the King brothers. Everyone had to audition for VD, as I'm afraid Van Dam was known, and we turned up to present our act on a cold grey morning in March. In a small area under the stage, already full of waiting auditionees, we changed into our KB outfits, shirts and clip-on bow ties, and 3 different coloured jackets. Whilst doing so, I became fascinated by a man next to us in clown makeup and bright orange wig, who had obviously been there for some time preparing for his act, and who seemed to have a rather complicated outfit. There had been much pre-setting of things going on, things that lit up or buzzed or beeped or whirled around or came out of his sleeves and pockets, hems, lapels and so on. And as his call came to go up on stage, he was frantically trying to tie on a pair of roller skates. Intrigued, I followed him up into the wings to watch his audition. He handed his music to the pianist, made some last-minute adjustments to his gadgetry. The piano struck up the intro of a song called Happy Feet, and the man started to tap dance on his roller skates. But before he could open his mouth or indeed press any of his buttons, buzzers or levers, a voice from the stalls called out, "Thank you, next!" And the bewildered man exited stage left, Pagliacci-like, to no doubt spend the next hour having to take everything off again. Our audition was fortunately more successful. Not only did we get through our entire song without interruption, we were booked by VD for a 6-week season to commence a month later. Our deal was £40 per week minus the booking agent's 10% commission, and this was split amongst the 3 of us. We played 6 shows a day, starting at noon and finishing at 10 p.m, 6 days a week. That's 36 shows for £36. In other words, £1 per show, again to be split amongst the 3 of us, which in old money worked out at 6 shillings and 8pence each per show. Once again, I was underage, so needed to get a special licence to perform. The management was particularly concerned because our act followed the fan dancer. Presumably you had to be at least 16 to see a lady naked. The piano player would play an introduction. The blue velvet tabs would swing open, a rather camp tenor in a dinner suit standing at the side of the stage would start singing in a strangled voice, and a group of windmill lovelies, as they were known, in flimsy flowing outfits would glide on and move around, occasionally to the music. There were no complicated dance routines. The lovelies were there solely to set the scene. After about a minute of this, the fan dancer, naked except for two ostrich plume fans strategically positioned, would be discovered amongst the girls, and she too would sashay around vaguely to the music, all the while keeping her important regions covered by the plumes. As the song was reaching its end, she would pose in statuesque form upstage centre on a raised platform, and as the tenor in the dinner suit attempted to hit the final note, the fan dancer would open her arms to reveal her naked form, whereupon the tabs would instantly close. The whole thing was fairly tame by today's standards, but I wasn't allowed to see it. Instead of being able to wait in the wings, promising faithfully to look the other way or wear a bag over my head, I was made to stay up in our dressing room until I heard the tenors closing bars, whereupon I would tear down 3 flights of stairs 4 steps at a time, frantically push a mini piano on stage, and be ready at the keyboard, hands poised and smiling, when the tabs opened on our act. Mike and Tony, meanwhile, would have strolled casually into position, having been legally lurking off-stage right, getting eyefuls of forbidden parts. As the curtain rose, the sound of silence which greeted the King brothers was broken only by the crinkling of sandwiches being unwrapped, newspapers being brought out, and the squeak of theatre seats tipping up. As the shows at the Windmill were continuous, the audience could come and go as they pleased. If there were 10 or 15 people in at 2 in the afternoon, you'd be lucky, and at least half of them would get up and leave as soon as they realised we weren't going to be nubile females with ostrich plumes. You got used to it, and besides, it wasn't just us that died a death. On the odd occasion, a comedian got a laugh. It was undoubtedly from some drunk who'd wandered in off the street and who was quickly shown the door. We were all there, really, only to fill a gap while the girls went up to the canteen on the top floor for a cigarette and a cup of tea. The same canteen, incidentally, which was also a favourite King brother hangout, especially the younger, newly licensed one with his eyes on stalks, because the girls rarely bothered to wear anything more than skimpy, see-through robes. I can only remember one out of a total of 216 performances at the Windmill that didn't end in stony silence for us. It was the last show on a Saturday night. There'd been a football match that day at Wembley Stadium between England and Scotland. Scotland had won, and their supporters, victorious in their tartan, descended on London, many of them packing themselves into the Windmill. They loved every act. They loved the comedian, Hugh Lloyd. They loved the cartoonist, Inky Williams. They, of course, loved the girls, but the King brothers, for reasons we'll never know, sent them into a frenzy. The audience was on its feet, delirious. We took our bow to rapturous applause and whoops and whistles of acclaim, and as we came off, the stage manager hastily pushed us back on for a second bow, something that had never happened before, and we were in shock. In the heady rush to get back on stage, Mike slipped on the glass floor, the girls were lit from underneath, and fell onto his guitar, breaking it in half. And there you were thinking Pete Townsend invented this. The Scots assumed this was part of the act and gave Mike another standing ovation. As if doing 6 shows a day at the Windmill wasn't enough, after our last one we'd drive over to Berkeley Square to the Astor Club, a seedy establishment frequented by hostesses, hookers, dancers, gangsters, and the occasional sozzled celebrity, and do 2 more shows, finishing around 2 a.m, after which Mike would drive us in the Ford Zephyr back to Hornchurch. Every other Saturday we also managed to fit in an appearance on a children's television show called Sugar and Spice. You know, whenever I hear a performer complaining these days that 8 shows a week is too demanding, claiming exhaustion or vocal strain, so send on the understudy, I think back on those Windmill days and wonder just how long any of them would have lasted with old Van Damme. Ostrich plumes or not. The end of a long, wet 20-week summer season, at the end of the long, wet North Pier in Blackpool, where the theatre was located, was crowned by a long, wet pre-motorway drive home to Essex in a car not only full of King brothers, suitcases, instruments and an actor friend named Bunny May, but one in which the windscreen wipers packed up 20 miles south of Blackpool. Through a crony at the Ford Motor Company, where else, my father had acquired for us a used Ford V8 Pilot shooting brake which had seen service for King George VI on the Sandringham estate up in Norfolk. A bulky, cumbersome, wooden-bodied vehicle with a bench seat in front, driving it, according to Mike, who never allowed Tony nor me near the wheel, was like manoeuvring a tank, though how he'd know about tanks I don't know, having failed his medical for national service, along with Tony and me, but that's another story. The shooting brake had flick-out indicators, a windscreen that opened outwards, a wind-up starting handle like you see in old Buster Keaton films, and another handle inside on the dashboard for manually working the wipers, which I proceeded to do like a robot for the next 7.5 hours of unrelenting rain all the way back to Chingford, where we still lived with our parents. Variety performers based their year around getting a summer season. It guaranteed you employment for a good 4 months, and you could still do the odd Sunday concert to boost your wage packet for the week. Blackpool had been the King brothers' 5th summer season in a row, and, according to press cuttings, we'd already startled Southport with our ability and stage presence, with me apparently reducing the audience to tears in my first acting role as a poor urchin who wanted to buy flowers for his blind mother but only had threepence, and exiting to thunderous applause and the sound of sobbing. In Weymouth, we kept up the swift tempo of the show. In Southsea, we appear to have been totally unmemorable. No cuttings exist. And in Morecambe, we were particularly well received for our smart musical numbers. What was not reported was that the man who ran the theatre there made our lives and everyone's an utter misery. The Central Pier Theatre, Morecambe, was roughly the size of a village hall, and the summer show was called the Starlights, as it had been every year for 12 years. It was comprised mostly of sketches and novelty acts, loosely linked, and I use the word loosely very loosely. Unlike Variety, however, this did entail rehearsing together as a unit, because you were all required to participate in the ensemble pieces in order to fill up the stage. You rehearsed the show for a week, played it for a week, during which you rehearsed a new show, eventually ending up with 3 shows in all, which were then rotated, after which your daytime was your own. In theory. There were 15 artistes, as we were known. Ali Wilson, a Scottish comedian, headed the bill. Resort towns in the northwest of England used to attract a large contingent of Scots coming down during Waits Week, which were holidays originally for mill workers seeking fun and frolics at the seaside. There was also Arthur Sumner, billed as Wilson's admirable foil and a tenor of merit, a real tightwad who used to sneak sips of Guinness from the glass of one of the musical clowns, Earl and Elgar, while they were on stage, and then top up the glass with water. There was Howarth Nuttall, a baritone, Mary Redfern, a soprano, Lucy Loupé, a soubrette and, according to one review, a real stalwart in the comedy sketches, Jewel Morell, dancer and daughter of the producer, the 4 lovelies, one of whom was rather gifted above the waist and to whom I was enormously attracted at age 15. 2 piano players completed the cast, Arthur Jackson, a sweet old queen, and Ray Fenton, father of Kate, who later married actor Ian Carmichael. The producer was Eddie Morell. Now, that name may mean little or nothing to you, but to those of us who performed on the Central Pier Morecambe in 1955, it conjures up mild feelings of retribution, tantamount to wishing him hanged, drawn and quartered, or seeing his head on a spike at the end of the pier. Small, red-faced, with a fiery temper, Eddie Morell had a vindictive nature and ran the Pier Theatre with all the bonhomie that Stalin ran the gulags. Nobody in the show liked him, with the possible exception of his daughter Jewel. The contract he drew up for the Starlights Company had a cunning clause that stipulated matinees every day if wet or inclement. Inclement being the key word here, for the summer of 1955 was one of the sunniest, hottest, driest summers on record. Cloudless skies stretched endlessly overhead, and every day dawned clear and blue and promising. Picnics, outings, day trips to the countryside, all beckoned seductively. Alas, they were not to be. Comrade Morell insisted that the whole company meet in the stalls of the Central Pier Theatre every day at 1 o'clock in the afternoon to await his verdict as to whether or not the weather was inclement. He would arrive at least 45 minutes late. We all sat there waiting in the stifling heat, stewing and wondering where you could hire a hitman in Morecambe. And finally we'd hear the lobby doors behind us swing open. We then hear what very quickly became the intensely irritating tread of Morell's feet as he slowly and deliberately made his way down the creaking aisle, pausing only to look out the side window of the auditorium, perhaps in the faint hope that a sudden monsoon had zeroed in on Morecambe Bay. He would then mount the steps to the stage, face the assembled gathering of hugely pissed-off performers, and pause. Eventually, and with a look of acute disappointment at being unable to detain us any longer, he would make the inevitable announcement in his whiny, nasal, high-pitched voice. "Due to the weather conditions, there will be no matinee." And before he could say the word "today," the entire Starlights Company would be on our feet and out the door and into the baking sunshine. Morell did this every day for 12 weeks, and every day for 12 weeks our summer hopes and dreams were shattered, particularly my chance to see the fourth lovely in her bikini. The following summer, Frank Earle, one of the musical clowns, picked up the sign that said "Matinees every day if wet or inclement," and hurled it off the pier, then thumped Morell, knocking him off too. Sadly, the tide was in, and I believe he survived. Blackpool's summer season 1958, on the other hand, was a summer Eddie Morell would have loved. It rained incessantly for 20 weeks. The pier was, and still is, a quarter of a mile long with virtually no shelter along it, and the theatre was situated at the far end. You'd arrive at the stage door drenched and windswept, and breathless from running the gauntlet of holidaymakers intent on intercepting you, people who were either on their way to see the show or had already seen it. "You better be good tonight, we're paying bloody good money to see you." "Hey, you're a lot smaller than you look on telly." David Nixon of TV's What's My Line, one of the stars of the summer show, had the misfortune of being not only extremely tall, but in possession of a very recognisable bald head, so was an especially easy target even while dashing down the wet pier. He loathed being accosted and used an assortment of disguises to avoid being recognised. Hats, wigs, false noses, whiskers, spectacles. But they never worked, and he'd arrive at the stage door seething. "Saw t' show last night, didn't think much of it," I heard someone once say to him. Despite the foul weather and David's occasionally foul mood, it was a happy company. Billy Dainty, Edmund Hockridge, Joan Regan, David Nixon were all delightful. Also some identical spinster twins in their 50s who drove a vintage car around the stage. There must have been more to the act. Anyway, whose names I've forgotten. You'd all meet up at the theatre in the morning to check for post, then go off and have a coffee, probably head to the cinema in the afternoon, and most nights after the show all go out for a bite to eat together. Sundays were the same, apart from not having a show to do. And then it happened. During a chance outing to the Open Championship at Royal Lytham, my brother Tony and I discovered a game called golf, and from then on there were never enough hours in the day. Fortunately, golf, as everyone knows, at least in this country, is one of those versatile sports with which one can while away one's leisure time quite contentedly in almost any weather. All one needs is one's waterproofs, fortitude, and a degree of insanity in the family, and I will not at this time discuss in detail my birdie at the 6th at Hoylake, or indeed take you through every round I've ever played, hole by hole. That would be more my brother Tony's field, really, and this is my show, not his. But let me just say that having a hobby, and one that can be enjoyed anywhere, made life on the road away from home just that little more bearable. While golf was the high point of our summer in Blackpool, the low point was the accommodation my father had arranged for us. He rarely got involved in any of the mundane, practical aspects of our career, being much more adept at pointing out our names on posters to anyone passing and letting them know we were his lads. But when he found out that an old school friend of his named Harry Ashton, a man who for once had nothing to do with the Ford Motor Company, owned a small hotel on the North Shore called the Atlantic, a typical seaside boarding house, Dad got in touch. It was already fully booked out, but as a favour to Mum and Dad, Harry said he'd find room for us for the season and do us a special deal. Dad patted himself on the back. The deal turned out to be very special indeed. It consisted of cramming a third single bed into a small room that had two already in it. Harry Ashton charged us £9 per week each, making it a total of £27 for the room. We found out that the normal charge was £18. A month after we moved in, a friend of the King family, Mike McDonnell, a golf journalist, came up to cover the Open Championship, couldn't find a place to stay, asked us if there was by chance any spare room at the Atlantic. We asked Harry. Harry said yes, of course, crammed another single bed into our already tight accommodation and ended up getting £36 per week for a room you had to walk across beds in order to get in or out of. The Atlantic's other main attraction was the breakfast gong, situated directly outside our door, which was energetically struck, presumably by Harry, to announce the two morning sittings, the first at 7:30, the second 45 minutes later, or roughly the time it took us all to stop vibrating. As another great favour, Harry suggested we boys might like to borrow his caravan for a Sunday overnight near Windermere up in the Lake District. He said we looked tired and needed a break, which was true, but why the three of us, who spent every moment of every day and night together, would even contemplate spending our one day off together, I can't begin to fathom. But we did, primarily to escape the Atlantic, I imagine. First thing on a wet Sunday morning, Tony, Mike and I set off in King George VI's old V8 pilot shooting brake to make our way north to Wordsworth country, intending to wander lonely as a cloud that floats on high o'er vales and hills, but all we saw was blinding rain, no sign of bleeding daffodils. Nor, in fact, Lake Windermere. Hours of winding roads later, we managed to locate the caravan deep in the woods. It was at first sight something of a disappointment. It looked like a small wooden box on wheels. Nevertheless, we made a dash for it through the torrential downpour, and in no time at all made the discovery that the inside was even less inviting than the outside. The green interior walls, which we'd thought were painted, turned out to be stripes of mould and mildew. There was no loo or kitchen, and, not surprisingly, it was cold. After much fiddling with valves and matches, one of us managed to get the Calagas heater lit, whereupon we unwrapped our cheese sandwiches, got out a pack of cards and squeezed ourselves around a fold-down table in front of a wrinkled plastic window down which water was furiously sheeting to enjoy our holiday. Within minutes we were overcome by gas fumes and had to open the door. The rain poured in. We lasted perhaps 45 minutes, after which, by unanimous decision, any plans for an overnight stay were abandoned. We piled back into the shooting brake, set off into the mist, and once we'd understood we were on the main road and had stopped looking for it, returned post-haste to the Atlantic, which had suddenly taken on all the allure of the Beverly Hills Hotel. Another few weeks there, however, was enough to cure us of this mental aberration, and we checked out, moving into a large house that singer Edmund Hockridge had rented, along with his wife Jackie, dancer Terry Donovan, who later became and still is Mrs. Barry Cryer, and actor-comedian Jack Douglas, who, by the way, later went on to give one of the least convincing portrayals of Long John Silver in the history of Treasure Islands I've ever seen, in a musical version that Willis Hall and I had been commissioned to write for Birmingham Repertory Theatre. Harry Ashton was not best pleased by our departure, apparently, and complained to my father that we had let him down and ruined his summer. Mum, Dad and our sister Moira had come up to see us in Blackpool, and I know stayed at the Atlantic too, but I assume in their own room, because I'm pretty sure I would have remembered had Harry stuffed 3 more beds into ours.
Good night. Good night.
Sometime later in 1955, Denny Boyce, a local Ilford bandleader who billed himself as Denny Boyce, the band of your choice, had stepped into the illustrious shoes of Mr. Ron Sensier, head gasket fitter of the Ford Motor Company, to become the new manager of the King brothers. And thanks to him, we spent a thoroughly miserable Christmas and New Year away from our family, shivering and starving on an airbase in Germany. Denny Boyce, the band of your choice, had negotiated for us a month's tour of US Air Force bases. Mike was 20, Tony was 18, and I, by then at 16, was for some reason still underage and needed to secure a special magistrate's licence to perform. It was our first time out of England. Excited but nervous, we bid our farewells, a kiss for Mum and little Moira, a handshake for Dad, and in mid-December boarded a train with our luggage, the double bass and Mike's guitar. We then boarded another train and then a boat. Arriving at Ostend in the dark, we found our way to the railway station onto yet another train and arrived in Frankfurt as dawn broke on a freezing Monday morning, where we had to wait for a connection to Kaiserslautern, our final destination. We were directed to a railway waiting area designated for non-Germans. Almost as soon as we'd sat down, an American woman leapt up and screamed, "I've been robbed! He took my purse!" She pointed to a scruffy young man running out the door. Through the station window, we watched as two German policemen looking like SS guards in helmets, long black leather coats and jackboots gave chase. They grabbed the man, threw him to the platform, and while one held him down, the other kicked him again and again and again. This was our welcome to Germany, 10 years after the war. Some hours later, cold, hungry, tired, and still somewhat shaken, we stumbled off a military bus at the airbase just outside Kaiserslautern, then home to the largest US military community outside the United States, and where it soon became apparent that no one had ever heard of the King brothers, let alone expected us, nor knew quite what to do with us. There had been no instructions preceding us from Denny Boyce, the band of your choice, warm and cosy back in England, and whose final instructions to us had been that we'd be met, provided with funds, and boys, everything will be taken care of. We had only small change in our pockets and no way of contacting anyone. Eventually some kind military man found us accommodation in the officers' quarters. As we were unpacking, there was a knock on the door. In walked a familiar face, Billy Uke Scott, a performer with whom we had worked precisely once. He played the ukulele and sang comic songs, not unlike George Formby, but whom we greeted almost tearfully, as if he were part of the family. Billy invited us into his quarters, which were warmer than ours, and where he was in the process of having breakfast, which he continued to prepare in front of us and then eat in front of us without offering us any. 3 pairs of eyes watched his every move, dog-like, as his hand went from table to mouth. After he'd consumed his delicious-smelling boiled eggs, hot toast and tea, Billy Uke asked if we'd like a lift into town. I think we wanted to get stamps for postcards home to say what a good time we were having, or possibly make a plea for a Red Cross parcel. He pulled the car over to drop us in the middle of some Platz or other, turned, and unbelievably asked for money for the petrol. Even more unbelievably, we gave it to him, our last coins. For the record, Billy Uke Scott died in 2004. I didn't go to his funeral. I was worried I'd find a bill waiting for 40 litres of unleaded when I got there. What Denny Boyce, the band of your choice, also hadn't told us was that once we arrived at Kaiserslautern Air Base, we'd have to audition. In a vast, echoey, what appeared to be aircraft hangar, we joined a group of 30 or 40 hopefuls of various nationalities. In front of us sat an undulating mass of big-bellied, cigar-smoking, bourbon-swilling US Air Force Master Sergeants, all looking like less genial versions of Rod Steiger's redneck cop in the Heat of the Night. The audition process that followed was what I imagine a Saturday morning cattle market in Abilene might be like. You'd finish your act, the sergeants would loudly negotiate amongst themselves as to A, whether they thought you were any good, and B, if you were, who would have who for what date.
Hey, no way, you son of a bitch. I won the magic guy for Sunday. You already got that asshole on the banjo.
The King brothers sang a song called Mobile, Alabama, which must have struck a chord with the Rod Steigers, because afterwards we became the subject of much heated bartering and for the first time since we'd left Hornchurch felt very wanted. Our forthcoming appearances were not due to start until the 26th of December, 3 days later, which meant we still had no money even for food. Christmas dinner was celebrated in a sparsely populated soup kitchen on the base. We shared a table with a homesick and increasingly lachrymose NCO and 3 taciturn, stony-faced army privates nursing hangovers. Our tour consisted of one-night stands at US military bases around Bavaria. Lest you conjure up a fairy tale Disneyland castle picture of Bavaria, you should know that Bavaria in the winter of 1955 was still recovering from the war and had, from what we could see out of the bus window, all the appeal of a construction site in Gdansk. Secondly, unlike the acts one worked with in Twice Nightly Variety back in England, our co-performers here, with few exceptions, were only there to escape from something even more unpleasant somewhere else. They might be on the run from the taxman or ex-wives, some were draft dodgers, and one was almost certainly hiding from his own past. The great Alex, as he billed himself, juggled Indian clubs. Blonde, blue-eyed, of medium build, he kept to himself and never said a word to anyone. The first time we shared a dressing room with him was in Heidelberg. He acknowledged our hellos with a curt nod and turned away. As he stripped off his street clothes to change into his juggling clothes, we saw, briefly, before he quickly pulled his shirt down, a tattoo under his left arm. The Gothic lettering of the Waffen-SS was unmistakable. The shows themselves fell into a routine. You'd arrive somewhere, have a burger and a Coke in the PX, get changed in somebody's office next to a mute tattooed Nazi, go on and do your 20 minutes on a makeshift stage where occasionally the piano had been tuned, then get back on the bus to slip and slide on icy roads all the way back to Kaiserslautern. The audiences, mostly military men with the odd military wife thrown in, seemed grateful to see pretty much anything, but give them a bit of boogie-woogie and they'd go wild, sometimes too wild. We spent New Year's Eve performing, or attempting to, at an enlisted men's club on a US Army base at Würzburg. Whoever had organised the evening didn't want us to appear until just before midnight, so after we'd changed in the unheated storeroom they'd provided, we hung around drinking coffee for an hour and a half. I don't know what time the party had started, but by the time we made our entrance, the all-male audience was thoroughly sozzled. Loud and raucous, everyone seemed to be shouting and swearing or falling off their chairs. We made our way to our instruments. Nobody seemed particularly interested in our arrival. Mike plugged in his electric guitar, we took our positions, and we began our jolly opener. A soldier staggered onto the dance floor in front of us, brandishing a knife, but not at us, so we carried on. Someone lurched towards him, big black guy, then someone got up, a big white guy, then a couple more big black guys, then more big white guys, and within seconds a violent race war had broken out in the room. Chairs went flying, tables were overturned, bottles were smashed, suddenly blood and broken glass were everywhere. The King brothers played on. MPs with raised batons now stormed in, bashing heads right and left as they bulldozed around the room, and no sooner was one fracas suppressed than 3 others broke out. In the melee, Mike's amplifier lead was yanked out. Still we played on, rather like the band on the Titanic, until finally somebody had the presence of mind to lean over the piano and scream, "For Christ's sake, get the fuck out of here!" Which seemed like good advice, and which we then proceeded to do, sharpish. The thought of another 3 weeks entertaining troops became less appealing by the hour, but we had a contract, so we soldiered on to Wiesbaden, Mannheim, Rammstein, all the Steins, all of us desperately homesick, cold and fed up. In retrospect, it might have been sensible to drink ourselves senseless every night after the show, but we never thought of it. No groupies crowded round either to fight over us. Mike once attempted to impress a local Fräulein who'd spent time working as an au pair in Birmingham, but gave up when he couldn't cope with the impenetrable brummy Bavarian accent she'd acquired. Possibly the highlight of my entire trip was buying a bottle of Old Spice aftershave in the PX. I'd heard about it, but you couldn't buy it in England. When we arrived back in the UK, it was mid-afternoon. We went straight from the airport, our first flight almost as exciting as the aftershave, to the Granada Theatre in East Ham to do a week's variety, followed by another flight, this time to Amsterdam to perform on TV in honour of Princess Beatrix's 18th birthday, which happened to coincide with Tony's 19th. Tony sang Happy Birthday to Beatrix in Dutch, which he doesn't speak, and which I'm sorry to say wasn't recorded. Think Marilyn Monroe serenading JFK, but with not so nice a dress. According to an article headed Busy Agent in the February 1956 Romford Recorder, Denny Boyce, the band of your choice, but not necessarily mine, spent much of his time, quote, meeting the King brothers and seeing them off again at London Airport, unquote. But this can't possibly be true, since anyone who'd been responsible for the deluxe premier tour of Germany that we'd just experienced would have kept well out of our way.
In the next episode, we're into the swinging 60s, and for the King brothers, by now known as the singing group that sizzles, life feels a bit like a fairy tale. Signed up by a recording company wizard, we're rubbing shoulders with my showbiz heroes. And I have an interesting run-in with a couple of genuine villains. See you then. Key Changes is a Brudenus production.